Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video, where today I will be addressing a claim I've seen made a lot recently, as apparent proof that the moon landings must have been faked. The claim being that the camera film could not withstand being exposed to the vacuum of space, and thus the Apollo photos, which were taken on film, could not therefore have been taken on the moon. Now, the main proponents of this claim seems to be our old friends, the Apollo detectives. And I have somewhat addressed this claim in the past by highlighting that NASA didn't use regular, off-the-shelf consumer film on Apollo. Instead, they had special order film made by Kodak. However, the Apollo detectives continue to make these claims, having made several videos about me in recent weeks and constantly referencing their article on the Owl's website where they say they put camera film in a vacuum chamber and that the film outgassed and caused the colours in the photos to go weird. And making then the very bold conclusion that therefore all camera film would outgas if exposed to a vacuum, and therefore no film cameras could possibly ever be used in space unless they were pressurized. But this argument is incredibly easy to debunk and highlights what seems to be a growing trend with the Apollo detectives of confirmation bias and intentionally misrepresenting arguments. You see, in their own article about the film in a vacuum, the tail end of it brings up the KH-9 hexagon satellite, which was a model of keyhole reconnaissance satellite that was used by the United States between 1971 through to the mid-1980s. And the reason that the Apollo detectives highlight this particular model of satellite is because it used a film camera system, and the entire system was pressurized with 1 psi of nitrogen gas. Ergo, all film cameras in space must be pressurized, otherwise they wouldn't work. Or so they claim. Now, Marcus Allen of the Apollo detectives even brought up the KH-9 during a debate he had about the moon landings and stated that the KH-9 was one of only 2 film cameras that were ever used in space.
Tell me the 2 spacecraft that used photographic film in space, in orbit.
However, as clued in by the naming of the KH-9 satellite, there were actually 8 other models of keyhole satellites which preceded the hexagon. There was the Corona program, which had the KH-1 through to KH-4. There was the KH-5 Argon, the KH-6 Lanyard, KH-7 Gambit, and the KH-8 Gambit 3. And whilst there seems to be quite limited information about the Argon and Lanyard satellites, because these were quite short-lived programs, there's lots of information about the Corona and Gambit programs, including the fact that their camera systems were not pressurized, so their films were exposed to a vacuum and yet still worked. So a pretty easy debunk, but that doesn't stop the Apollo detectives from trying to give excuses. See, someone going by the name Truth vs. Lies recently popped up in the comments of one of my videos talking about the claims of film outgassing in a vacuum. And you could just tell from the wording that they'd got this idea from the Apollo detectives. And to their credit, they actually went back and quizzed the detectives about the Corona satellites and asked what kind of special film was used in those. And the Apollo detectives tried to offer an excuse. Unfortunately, this is where we come to how they are now getting tangled up in their own lies, because they immediately contradict themselves. They first responded stating that the Corona satellites flew barely 100 miles above Earth, so there was no need for a pressurized camera at that altitude. Except there was seemingly another comment after this, which is no longer visible, from a dark fen. And whilst I don't know what their comment was, the detectives responded to it, stating that the Corona photos are all grainy, as you would expect from the film outgassing with there being no atmosphere. So having just argued that Corona didn't need to be pressurized because of its altitude, they then immediately contradict their own argument by saying that the Corona film was outgassing because of its altitude. Now, it's true that the very early satellite systems were found that the film was outgassing and becoming very brittle. However, that problem was very quickly recognized as being due to the use of acetate-based camera film, and the Eastman Kodak company subsequently developed a new film type with a polyester base that solved the outgassing issue. Between the Corona, Gambit, and Gambit 3 programs, there was a total of 237 launches of unpressurized film satellites versus 20 launches of hexagon satellites. Now, if they were having problems with the film, you'd think it would have taken them less than 237 flights to figure it out and come up with a solution. In reality, they did not just keep throwing up hundreds of satellites and thinking, why do all the photos keep coming back looking bad and why is the film gone all brittle? And then after 230 odd flights, they thought, maybe the film needs to be pressurized. They very quickly spotted that they weren't getting the results they were expecting and immediately tweaked the design until it worked. Only then did they press the satellite into regular usage. It's very much like trying to iron out bugs when it comes to coding software. Which brings us to today's sponsor, boot.dev. These days, so much of our lives involves using coded programming. I actually did a bit of programming for my degree back in university. And according to a 2024 study in the United States, the median salary of a back-end developer is $100,000. So if you fancy a change of career or just a new hobby, boot.dev is the smartest way to learn how to do programming. It will guide you through learning languages such as Python, SQL, and Go. It will show you how to write the code for yourself, how to figure out errors in the syntax in order to make the programs run, and you can do it all at your own pace. I've been trying out some of the classes myself, and it certainly takes me back to my younger days in university. There are even some great features like Boots, a personal AI assistant who will help you with your programming, as well as access to their instant verification tools that check your coding is correct, as well as an extensive Discord community of programmers who are on hand to help you if you ever need them. So check out boot.dev today using my code Dave McKeegan for 25% off, and all with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So why exactly was Hexagon pressurized if the previous ones weren't? Well, whilst you'd be forgiven for thinking that the various satellite models were all developed one after the other, in fact, the various programs were being developed a lot alongside each other. The Coronas began with the KH-1 launching in 1959, followed by KH-2s in 1960, but then at the same time, the Argon satellites were being developed and the KH-5 flew in 1961. So through 1961, there was a mix of KH-2s and KH-5s being launched. Then Corona upgraded the KH-2 to the KH-3. Ultimately, though, the most commonly flown Corona was KH-4 beginning in February 1962, and these flew right the way until 1972. Then for the Gambits, the KH-7 was flown from 1963 to 1967, so right in the middle of the period where they were using the Corona satellites. In reality, this is because the Corona and the Gambits were two different philosophies of satellites. The Corona series was designed to photograph large areas of land in one go in order to discover new targets. But due to limitations in the camera design, this meant there wasn't much detail visible in the photographs. Whilst the Gambit series were designed to obtain highly detailed images, but because of the very narrow view of the camera and the limited amounts of film on board, they had to be very selective about what they photographed, i.e. targets like military installations, but they had to know there was something there in the first place before they could go and photograph it. The Hexagon was designed to try and bridge the gap between these two series by offering the high amounts of detail from the Gambit series with the broad area coverage of Corona. And being a much larger satellite would allow it to carry multiple times more film to be able to cover much greater areas of territory. However, to do this meant having a lot of film running through the camera in a very short amount of time. We're talking somewhere in the region of 200 inches or 5 meters of film every second running through the camera. This is where the vacuum presented a problem. When film runs through a camera, it's obviously passing against a lot of internal mechanisms, such as rollers, and the film will rub slightly against these internals, which can cause bits of static to build up. And the faster that it runs through the camera, the quicker the static will build. Now, if there's an atmosphere surrounding the internals, the static can discharge into that surrounding air. But obviously in a vacuum, it can't. So it would wind up building up a large static charge, which could then discharge into the film and damage it. Static was a known potential problem during the development of the Apollo cameras, which is what led Hasselblad to change the internal materials to prevent static from building up in the first place. And seemingly another factor as to why the KH9s were pressurized can be found in this presentation by Phil Prezell, who I believe was one of the designers that worked on the Hexagon system.
Because if the film was in space in a vacuum for an extended period of time, the emulsion would, and the water in the film would evaporate. So we had to keep it pressurized at a very low pressure, like less than 1 pound per square inch.
So he states that it had to be pressurized because the film would eventually outgas over time.
If the film was in space in a vacuum for an extended period of time,
not instantly. And the Hexagon missions lasted much longer than Corona or Gambit, or indeed Apollo. So film outgassing was a problem over long periods of time, not over the matter of hours that the Apollo cameras were subjected to. But Marcus argues that any film would outgas in a vacuum and that it would do it very quickly.
That's the light-sensitive emulsion. That's what's damaged in a vacuum, not the backing. The light-sensitive emulsion is affected very rapidly, especially on the moon. Test it out.
Plus, the extra cherry on the cake of this argument is the KH9 first flew in June 1971. After this launch, they flew another 3 KH4 missions, finishing in May 1972. And they also flew a further 23 KH8 missions up till Flight 54, which launched in April 1984. That was only 3 months before the launch of the final KH9 mission in June 1984. So during the 13-year period that they flew 20 missions of the Hexagon with a pressurized camera system, that exact same time frame, they flew 23 Gambits with unpressurized cameras. So if the film couldn't work in a vacuum, or the image quality was impacted by a vacuum, like the detectives claim, then why did they not only continue using unpressurized film satellites for more than a decade after the introduction of the Hexagon, but they even used more of them than Hexagon? Answer: because not all film will outgas in a vacuum. Now, I'm sure Marcus's response to this will be something along the lines of what he said before: where's the special film?
Dave will say that will outgas in a vacuum because it's not NASA's 3000 series magical film.
It was special order, wasn't it? SO film. And you can make that whatever you want, can't you? If it's special order, it must be anti-radiation, anti-vacuum, anti-everything you don't want it to be. But they've never shown that film. It's never been produced. Where is it? Now, if Dave can acquire some samples of that specific film, we'd love to see it. Really would. So come on, Dave, get your shopping boots on, get into the internet, find that special order film.
It seems he has this mindset that if Kodak had developed this special film that could withstand being in a vacuum, then it should be readily available to the public. Except I would have one question for Marcus. Given how much he likes to go on about how he has more experience in film photography than I do, and presumably he knows quite a few other people with vast experiences of film photography as well, I would ask, how often has he, or anybody he knows, ever been in a situation where they've needed to take photographs whilst in a vacuum? Because I suspect the answer will be somewhere in the region of never. Then consider it would cost more for Kodak to produce such a specialized film, so it would cost more for the consumer to buy it. Then imagine you walk into a camera shop and you say to the person behind the counter, "I'd like to buy some Kodak film, please," and they put 2 rolls in front of you, and one is more expensive than the other. Well, your immediate thought's going to be, why is that one more expensive? To which the worker will reply and say, you can use that one in a vacuum. Okay, does it do anything else? Nope. Day to day you won't notice any difference, but if you take the cheap one in a vacuum, it'll be ruined. If you take the more expensive one in a vacuum, it'll still work fine. Okay, well, I never shoot inside a vacuum, so I might as well have the cheaper one. Basically, who is going to buy something so specialized if they don't actually need it? The only demand for such film is situations where the camera's in a vacuum, which narrows the target audience down to pretty much space agencies. And let's not forget, the US were not the only country with spy satellites. They were flying their satellites to spy on the Soviets, but the Soviets also had their own spy satellites. So not only was there little incentive for Kodak to make such films publicly available, but I suspect that the US probably had some agreements with Kodak that any film that was developed for use by the US government was to remain secret. Now, over the last few years, the detectives have done quite a few videos aimed at me. However, recently they seem to have been on a roll with them. And of course, claims that the film could not withstand being in a vacuum.
If you put photographic film in a vacuum, even a relatively low level of vacuum, as you have done, Robert and Scott, you've done the tests on it, at the very least, the film is affected by the vacuum.
They bring this up and they claim that I refuse to talk about their arguments of film outgassing in a vacuum.
So come on, Dave, you've got a bit of homework to do. We've done most of this, so we're giving you the fruits of our investigation over the past many years. And it was helpful for you to get things right, such as vacuum, the effect of vacuum in space, on photographic film, this stuff. Vacuum has an effect on photographic film. You didn't mention that. You didn't mention anything to do with vacuum. Why not? Were you uninformed, or were you just omitting it because it didn't add to your story?
It didn't fit his narrative. Those guys will never touch vacuum. They won't go near it. Not one of them.
No, they don't. None of them.
Now, obviously, I've addressed the claims here, but 2 months ago they published this video called Dave's Dilemma. Now, that video immediately seemed a bit odd to me because it was only about 7 minutes long. Yet all their other videos are always around 30 minutes or more. And in that video, Marcus states that my dilemma is that if I accept that their film outgassed in their vacuum chamber, then I have to accept all film would outgas.
If Dave McKeegan says, yeah, I agree that photographic film will outgas in a vacuum, end of story. He can't say it. So he won't. He'll go around it. He'll come up with excuses.
Which, as we've already seen, is wrong, but his logic is ridiculous, because that's like saying, if you accept this piece of clothing is fire retardant, then you have to accept all clothing is fire retardant. But no firefighter is going to rush into a blazing inferno in jeans and a jumper. But what really struck me about that video was they were talking about an interaction that I had with Jeran, where I brought up the Apollo detectives' vacuum tests. Now, for those who don't know, Jeran, up until December, was a very prominent flat Earth believer until he went to Antarctica and he witnessed the 24-hour sun, which completely changed his worldview. But along with thinking that the Earth was flat, he'd also spent many years claiming the moon landings were faked. Now, I was on that same trip to Antarctica with Jeran, and he and I had many great discussions during our time there over various arguments relating to flat Earth, and they were very constructive and they were very polite. And I could see he was clearly taking the points that I was raising, taking them on board, and was trying to build his arguments around them rather than just dismissing the point like most conspiracy theorists do. So, having seen this and seen him admit that he was wrong, I suggested he and I should do a live stream discussion with each other where we present our arguments for and against the moon landings and try and rebut each other's points. Now, in the end, we wound up doing about 4 or 5 streams together, totaling some 14 hours. However, in the very first stream that we did, Jeran brought up the topic of film in a vacuum outgassing, which I addressed by presenting the exact same points that I did here regarding the KH satellites not needing pressurized cameras. So they had the KH-9, which were one of the later ones, but they also had KH-4 Corona satellites preceding them. Yeah, the Corona satellites, and it says the system was designed to operate without pressurization, again, to conserve weight, and the acetate-based film being used was tearing and breaking in a high vacuum existing in space and causing the camera to jam. A solution for this problem was found in substituting polyester for the acetate-based film. But I then brought up the Apollo detectives as being the main source of this claim and highlighting they've been caught out before being quite manipulative and dishonest with their information. Many of the occasions of which I've discussed in this previous video of mine, and they were caught doing the same with their vacuum tests as well. Because I've covered their Alice article before in a video a few years ago, and within that article, they showed the test that they did where they put film rolls in a vacuum chamber and then show the results. Now, firstly, they show a sequence of sample photos. The ones on the right being the film that was in the vacuum chamber, and the ones on the left are images that were taken with film that hadn't been in a vacuum, and they show that the colours have changed. Then they showed this side-by-side comparison of the two film strips with the caption, quote, "Changes to the film strips are visually apparent. Here, the vacuum-exposed film is on the left. The film has lost its sheen and has shifted to a brownish hue. The control strip is on the right," end quote. Except you'll notice if you look at the breaks between the negative areas, the film on the right raises up in the middle and it's curved down to the edges, whereas the film on the left is dropped in the middle and raised at the edges, which suggests that they're not showing a direct comparison between the front faces of both films, but instead one strip is face up and the other strip is face down. Then, last year, Marcus had a live debate against MC Toon on the Modern Day Debate channel, and MC Toon called him out on that film comparison.
You flip the film and you can see by the reflection the way that the film is bending. So you show the backside of the one film claimed that it was the dullness was caused by the vacuum, but you didn't show the correct side. This is a lie.
All right, we're going to have to give Marcus a chance here to respond.
And Marcus had absolutely no answer for it. Instead, he tried to deflect to bringing up the KH-9 satellite.
Yeah, at least up to a minute, maybe even two, just to get some of this aired out here, because you have brought up, like you said, this is something.
I'm fully aware that Mike is very persuasive to himself that he's right. Now, I asked you a question which you haven't yet answered. Which are the two spacecraft which flew in Earth orbit and in lunar orbit carrying photographic film? No,
irrelevant. You got caught lying.
It's not.
You're running away from that now.
It is not irrelevant. This is photographic film if anybody wants to see it.
And if you look at the article now, that photo's been removed, which to me points to them knowing that the photo was misleading and removing it after they were called out on it. So I was highlighting that exact misrepresentation to Jeran. He debated Marcus Allen a while ago and he actually brought up a screenshot of this. So on an earlier version of this page, they showed the film strips next to each other. And they said, here's the two film strips. The left one's the one that's not been in a vacuum. The one on the right has been in a vacuum. The one on the left was all glossy and shiny. The one on the right was matte and dull. And they specifically say in the article that the exposing it to a vacuum has basically taken the shine off the film. But when Marcus brings up the fact that I mentioned it, this is what he had to say.
Here we are, 35mm film. And if it's got S-star backing, that may not get damaged at low vacuum levels. What will get damaged is the light-sensitive emulsion. And you make the point about, well, you show the picture showing one side, and then you turn it over, and you show the other side. Yeah, there are two sides to it. That's the light-sensitive emulsion. That's what's damaged in a vacuum, not the backing.
As though I'm being unreasonable and that of course they're going to show the fronts and the backs of the film. Except they didn't. They seemed to show the front of one piece of film compared to the back of a completely different piece of film, and then tried to claim that the difference in the appearance was due to the effects of a vacuum chamber, and subsequently removed the image after they were questioned about it. However, where this leads to real dishonesty in my opinion is that their more recent videos about me, they assert that I apparently won't address the argument of film in a vacuum.
Vacuum has an effect on photographic film. You didn't mention that. You didn't mention anything to do with vacuum. Why not? Were you uninformed, or were you just omitting it because it didn't add to your story?
It didn't fit his narrative. Those guys will never touch vacuum. They won't go near it, not one of them.
No, they don't. None of them.
Except the very portion of my live stream with Jeran that they've made the response video to 2 months ago, where I was talking about them, the Corona satellites, and it says the system was designed to operate without pressurization, again, to conserve weight, and the acetate-based film being used was tearing and breaking in a high vacuum existing in space and causing the camera to jam. A solution for this problem was found in substituting polyester for the acetate-based film. And they make a response video only focusing on where I've referenced them, but conveniently ignoring where I talked about the KH satellites.
Why not? Were you uninformed, or were you just omitting it because it didn't add to your story?
And then, but a few weeks later, they're out making more videos about me, still asserting that no film can survive being in a vacuum, and trying to claim that I never addressed the topic. So, I wonder if they'd like to correct their stance on the situation now that I've made a video specifically highlighting how their vacuum claims are wrong. The daft thing here is, though, I'm not actually sure where their conspiracy line is. As in, what do they think is fake versus where do they think reality lies? For example, flat earthers just say anything related to space is fake because they think space isn't real. Yet, at the other end of the spectrum, I've seen people suggest that, yes, people can go to space, people have actually been to the moon, that Apollo went to the moon, but that the footage of Apollo was faked. And then there's people somewhere in the middle who accept you can go to space, but think they couldn't get as far as the moon, which seems to be the sort of area where the Apollo detectives sit. They seem happy to accept that spaceflight is real, that the ISS exists, and that people can get up there. I've never heard them have any issues with the first humans who went into space, like Yuri Gagarin or any of the Mercury flights. And the only Apollo aspects that they seem to have issues with are all the stuff beyond low Earth orbit. I've not heard them raise any claims that Apollo 7 or 9 were faked, which both stayed in low Earth orbit. But on Apollo 9, they did an EVA to test how easy it would be to transfer between spacecraft in the event that the tunnel ever became unusable. But during that EVA, they not only had 16mm film cameras running to record it, but they had a Hasselblad 70mm camera taking photos, all in the vacuum of space. Prior to Apollo, there was the Gemini program, which was used to develop many of the techniques which would be required on Apollo, such as locating spacecraft in orbit and docking with them. But they also did EVAs outside the spacecraft. The first was done by Ed White on Gemini 4 in 1965, but then there were numerous other and much longer EVAs. For example, on Gemini 9A, Gene Cernan did an EVA for more than 2 hours. Buzz Aldrin on Gemini 12 did 3 EVAs lasting a total of 5.5 hours. Now, during those EVAs, many photographs were taken outside the spacecraft with film cameras, and yet no film outgassing. And moreover, the Gemini spacecraft were a 2-seater craft with no partitions between them. It was a single space that the astronauts were in, and there was no airlock. So for them to do an EVA, they literally depressurized the entire capsule and opened the doors, which meant any and all camera film that they had on board was subjected to a vacuum. And finally, just to put the icing on the cake for all of this, I saw somebody commenting on their video asking about film cameras on the ISS. And the detectives responded stating that all the cameras used outside the space station are digital. So they would never know unless one of the crew took a film camera outside with them. But that being said, the ISS didn't start construction until 1998, and yet human spaceflight continued after Apollo with the space shuttle. It was the shuttle that helped build the ISS in the first place. But there were many other shuttle flights, some to deploy and maintain satellites, some to visit other space stations like Mir, and some to just conduct experiments in orbit. And in fact, the space shuttle was part of probably one of the most famous photographs ever taken. This one during mission STS-41B, where astronaut Bruce McCandless was testing the MMU, or Manned Maneuvering Unit. This was the first time that astronauts on EVAs would have the ability to move themselves without being attached directly to a spacecraft. And thus we got this famous photo of Bruce becoming the first person ever to do an untethered spacewalk. Now sure, this particular photograph wasn't taken in a vacuum. You can actually see the reflection of the Challenger space shuttle in Bruce's visor. He seems to be floating near the top cabin windows in order to let the crew on board take some photographs and video of him. However, what you will notice is that just above Bruce's right shoulder, fitted to the MMU, is a camera. That is a Nikon F3 film camera. I believe it was actually responsible for taking this photograph looking back at the Challenger. And these cameras were not only used on the MMUs during EVAs, such cameras were also used by astronauts on EVAs outside the Mir space station as well. And these cameras were not sealed and pressurized either. The only protection that they had was some white thermal blankets fitted around them to stop them overheating because the camera bodies were typically black. So film cameras have been used extensively in a vacuum for decades without issue because they had film that was designed to withstand such conditions. Now, of course, this information alone does not mean that humans definitely walked on the moon. But it does mean that the argument that they couldn't have been on the moon because the film would have outgassed has been completely destroyed. I'm sure some people will still question, though, how the film could cope with the radiation. Now, that's something I'm going to do a separate video addressing. For now, though, that's going to wrap up this. Thanks once again to boot.dev for sponsoring this. If you've enjoyed the video and you haven't already done so, then please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.